The train car stank of unwashed bodies and terror, a smell Klaus Zimmermann had grown accustomed to over the 3 days they'd been rattling across America's heartland. He was 19 years old, pressed against the wooden slats with his shoulders hunched, trying to make himself invisible the way he'd learned to do in the chaos after Normandy. Around him, other prisoners sat in heavy silence, their whispered conversations having long since died away. They'd exhausted every rumour, every terrible story the regime had pumped into their heads about what Americans did to captured Germans. The torture, the starvation, the systematic brutality that awaited them. Klaus had spent 6 weeks preparing himself for what came next, steeling his mind against the inevitable horror. When the cattle car finally shuddered to a halt, every muscle in his body went rigid. This was the moment. This was where the real punishment would begin. The steel doors shrieked as they slid open, and August sunlight flooded in so bright it felt like a physical assault. Klaus threw his hand up to shield his face, his other hand instinctively gripping the sleeve of the man beside him. Then something impossible happened. The scent of fresh bread, actually baking somewhere nearby, drifted into the car. The smell was so utterly unexpected that Klaus wondered if exhaustion had finally broken his mind. An American guard shouted at them to get moving, his German atrocious but his tone strangely casual, almost bored. Klaus stumbled down the wooden ramp on legs that had gone numb from days of sitting, and what he saw made no sense whatsoever. The camp spread out before him under an enormous Texas sky, all clean white barracks with intact roofs and actual grass that someone was clearly watering. Guard towers stood at intervals, yes, but the men manning them looked relaxed, almost drowsy in the late summer heat. One of them was reading a magazine as if watching German prisoners was no more interesting than watching paint dry. Someone gestured toward a processing line, and Klaus shuffled forward with the others, still waiting for the trap to spring. It had to be a trap. But when he reached the front of the line, a Red Cross nurse, an actual woman, offered him a paper cup filled from a metal pitcher that had condensation beading on its surface. Cold water. Clean water. Klaus took the cup with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and stared at it, then at her. She smiled at him, tired but genuine, and moved on to the next man. He drank, and the water was so cold it hurt his teeth, so clean it tasted like nothing at all, like something miraculous. Processing took the rest of the afternoon, but nothing about it was cruel. They received numbers, got photographed, answered questions posed by a translator who seemed more frustrated with his own grammar than with any of them. Klaus was handed a bundle containing a clean uniform in olive drab with PW stencilled across the back, a towel, and a bar of soap that actually smelled like soap. In the medical tent, a doctor checked his teeth, peered in his ears, listened to his chest with cold metal instruments and wrote notes on a chart. No beatings materialized. No humiliation, just bureaucracy grinding through its paces. By evening, Klaus found himself in a mess hall that could hold 200 men, the noise of metal trays and conversations bouncing off the walls. He moved through the serving line in a complete daze. A man slopped beef stew onto his tray with actual chunks of meat swimming in thick gravy. Another added 2 slices of white bread, soft and pale. A third poured coffee, real coffee, black and steaming. Klaus carried his tray to a long table and sat down. Around him, other prisoners ate in stunned silence or with tears streaming down their faces. The portions were obscenely generous by any standard Klaus understood. He'd grown up in a Germany where butter had become a distant memory and meat something you only heard about. He'd enlisted in 1943, partly because the Wehrmacht promised regular meals. This was more food than he'd seen on a single plate in 2 years. He ate slowly, trying to make it last, trying to understand what was happening. Through the mess hall windows, he could see American guards changing shifts in the compound outside. They walked with easy confidence, laughing at something, one lighting another's cigarette. They looked well-fed, well-rested, completely unbothered by the hundreds of enemy soldiers eating 30 yards away. That night, Klaus was assigned to Barracks 7. His bunkmate was already there, a man in his 40s with deep lines carved around his eyes and grey threading through his dark hair. Otto Bauer introduced himself with a firm handshake and a laugh that sounded like broken glass. "First day?" he asked, settling onto the lower bunk. Klaus climbed to the upper bunk, his body aching, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. He didn't answer because he didn't need to. Otto pulled something from under his thin mattress, a creased magazine he'd somehow acquired. He held it up so Klaus could see the cover. Life magazine from 1943, showing a factory floor in Detroit with assembly lines stretching into impossible distance. Inside were more photographs, wheat fields that went to the horizon, cities with lights blazing, ships being built in rows like toys. "Take a good look, boy," Otto said quietly. "This is what they didn't show us. This is what we were really fighting." He tossed the magazine onto Klaus's bunk. "They make one tank every hour in that factory, one tank every single hour. We were building maybe 50 a month when I got captured." Klaus stared at the images until his eyes burned. Factories untouched by bombs, fields with no mines, cities whole and functioning. Somewhere in his mind, a small voice whispered what he couldn't yet say aloud. They never had a chance, not from the start. He lay back on the bunk and stared at the ceiling, feeling his entire understanding of the world begin to crack apart. Within a week, the routine had settled into something almost ordinary. Morning roll call, breakfast in the mess hall, then work assignments posted on a board outside camp headquarters. Klaus learned quickly that the Americans were obsessed with forms and protocols, everything documented, everything by the book. The Geneva Convention wasn't just a treaty here, it was treated like scripture. On his 8th day, Klaus found himself in a group of 6 prisoners standing in the compound yard while a sergeant checked names against his clipboard. The sergeant was maybe 30, with dark hair going grey at the temples and eyes that looked past you rather than at you. He wore his uniform like armour, every button fastened, every crease sharp. A Purple Heart ribbon sat above his left pocket. Klaus had learned enough to know what that meant. Wounded in combat, still serving. "Work detail," the sergeant said in English, then repeated in broken German. "Farm labour, you follow orders, you get paid. Script for canteen privileges." He gestured toward a waiting truck. "Let's go." They climbed into the truck bed, guards taking positions at front and rear. As they rolled through the camp gates, Klaus felt his chest tighten. This was the first time he'd been outside the fence since arriving. The Texas landscape stretched flat and endless, so much space it made him dizzy. Germany was small, crowded, every metre of land fought over for centuries. This looked like a country that had never known scarcity. The truck turned down a dirt road and stopped at a small farm. The house was modest, with white paint peeling in places, but the fields were carefully tended, rows of vegetables stretching in neat lines. A woman stood on the porch waiting. She wore men's work clothes, trousers and a faded shirt, her dark hair pulled back under a kerchief. She jumped down and spoke briefly with the sergeant. Klaus caught only fragments: 6 men, tomatoes, water break every hour. The woman nodded, her face unreadable, and walked toward them. "Good morning," she said in German, accented but clear. "I am Margaret Schreiber. You will call me Mrs. Schreiber. You are here to work, not to talk. Understand?" The prisoners nodded. Klaus studied her carefully. She was older than his mother would be now, if she still lived. Lines around her eyes spoke of sun and worry. Her hands were rough, capable. She looked at them without fear, but also without warmth, just a farmer evaluating workers. She led them into the tomato field and demonstrated the harvest technique, her German vocabulary surprisingly precise. Check for ripeness. Twist gently. Place in the basket. Don't bruise the fruit. Don't step on the vines. Simple work, but work nonetheless. They spread out along the rows. The morning sun climbed higher, turning the air thick and hot. Klaus's back began to ache within an hour. Beside him, Otto worked with methodical efficiency, his movements economical from years of practice. Down the row, the other prisoners worked in silence while guards watched from the field's edge. At mid-morning, Mrs. Schreiber appeared with a metal pail and tin cups, water, cool from a well. She poured for each man without ceremony, her face neutral. When she reached Klaus, their eyes met for just a moment. He saw nothing there, no hatred, no pity, just practicality. He was a worker. She needed workers. Nothing more complicated than that. She drank from the same pail after they finished, sitting on her porch steps. At lunch, she brought out sandwiches, cheese and mustard on brown bread, and distributed them evenly. 6 for the prisoners, 2 for the guards, 1 for herself. Everyone ate the same food. Klaus couldn't remember the last time he'd seen such casual equality. Sergeant Kowalski sat against the truck, eating slowly, his eyes never leaving the prisoners, but Klaus noticed something. The way the sergeant's jaw tightened when Otto mentioned having daughters back home. The way his hand went still when another prisoner asked about the likelihood of letters reaching Germany. The man was listening, maybe against his will, but listening. By day's end, Klaus's hands were stained red from tomato juice and his shoulders screamed, but the work had been honest. Mrs. Schreiber inspected their harvest, nodded once, and told Kowalski they could return tomorrow if they performed this well consistently. On the truck ride back, Otto leaned close. "You see it now," he whispered. "She didn't treat us like prisoners, not like enemies, just like workers she needed." He shook his head slowly. "They don't waste energy on hatred here. They're too busy being productive." Klaus watched the Texas landscape roll past, the endless fields, the distant oil derricks, the towns untouched by war. Otto was right. These people treated the Geneva Convention like it mattered because they could afford to. They had so much that mercy wasn't a sacrifice. It was just another form of efficiency. That night in the barracks, Klaus wrote a letter home, knowing it would be screened, but hoping it might somehow reach his mother. He kept it simple, safe, but one line slipped through before he could stop himself. "Mama, if you could see this place, you would not understand what they told us anymore." He sealed the envelope and handed it to the camp clerk, feeling like both a traitor and a truth-teller. 3 weeks passed like water finding its level. The work detail became routine. Truck rides at dawn, long days in Maggie's fields as they'd started calling her, truck rides back at dusk. Klaus's hands grew calloused, his German pallor darkening under the relentless Texas sun. He learned English in fragments, picking up words from the guards and Maggie's terse instructions. Careful, more baskets, good work. That last phrase surprised him most. Good work, as if their labour had value beyond punishment. Maggie's farm began to flourish under their careful tending. The tomatoes came in heavy and ripe. The bean rows stood straight and productive. She paid them in camp scrip as required, small amounts that accumulated in their accounts. Klaus used his first earnings to buy a pencil and paper at the canteen, writing letters he wasn't sure would ever arrive. Otto bought tobacco and shared it freely, the old soldier's instinct for maintaining morale. Sergeant Kowalski remained a silent presence, watching from the field's edge or the truck bed, his face an unreadable mask. But Klaus noticed small changes. The way the sergeant no longer flinched when Otto spoke about his daughters, Anna 12 and Sophie 9, last seen in 1943 when Otto shipped east. The way Kowalski's hand would drift to his shirt pocket where Klaus had glimpsed the corner of a photograph once, quickly hidden. They were all carrying ghosts. The war had made them experts at it. One afternoon in late September, clouds rolled in from the west, heavy and dark with the promise of rain. They were harvesting the last of the season's squash when the first drops fell. Within minutes it became a downpour, the kind of sudden violence that turned dust to mud in seconds. "Barn!" Maggie shouted, pointing. They ran, guards and prisoners together, splashing through puddles that formed instantly. The barn was old but solid, hay-scented and dim. Everyone crowded inside, dripping and breathing hard. Thunder rolled across the prairie like artillery. For a moment they stood in awkward clusters, guards on one side, prisoners on the other, Maggie in between. Then Otto shook his head like a dog, spraying water, and laughed. It broke something. Someone else laughed. A guard offered a cigarette to the nearest prisoner, who accepted with a nod of thanks. Klaus found himself standing near Sergeant Kowalski, both watching rain hammer the field. The sergeant pulled out a pack of Lucky Strikes, tapped one out, then offered the pack to Klaus. Klaus hesitated, then took one. Kowalski struck a match, cupped his hands around the flame, and held it steady while Klaus leaned in. They smoked in silence while the rain drummed on the roof. Someone in the back of the barn started humming, unconscious, absent-minded. Klaus recognized the melody immediately. It was a folk tune, old as dirt, something his grandmother used to sing. But then one of the guards joined in, humming the same melody with different words. An American version of a German song, or maybe a German version of an American song. The tune had crossed the ocean so long ago that no one remembered which direction it had travelled first. Otto began to sing the German words softly. Another prisoner joined. Then one of the guards sang the English version. The lyrics were about home and longing and distance, universal in every language. For 3 minutes, standing in a barn in Texas while rain pounded the earth outside, they sang together. Not in harmony exactly, but in parallel. The same melody carrying different grief in different tongues. When the song faded, Sergeant Kowalski's face had changed. The mask had slipped. Klaus saw pain there, raw and recent. The sergeant looked at Otto, really looked at him, and Klaus saw the exact moment when the guard stopped seeing a uniform and started seeing a father separated from his children. Kowalski cleared his throat. "My brother," he said in halting German, "died. Omaha Beach." He touched his chest. "Here I have his picture." Otto nodded slowly. "I am sorry," he said in careful English. "War takes everyone's brothers." They stood there, guard and prisoner, enemy and enemy, just two men who understood loss. Kowalski's hand went to his pocket but didn't pull out the photograph. Not yet, maybe not ever. But the acknowledgement hung between them, solid and real. The rain slowed to a drizzle. Maggie checked her watch and declared the day finished. On the truck ride back, Klaus felt something shift in his chest. He'd tasted Coca-Cola at the canteen yesterday, that strange sweet fizz that seemed to define America. He'd watched a Western in the camp theatre where Germans and Americans laughed at the same jokes. He'd received mail, a Red Cross notification that his letter had been forwarded, might reach his mother if she still lived. He was useful here, valued. Not a hero, not special, but not expendable either. Just a worker doing honest work for honest pay. The revelation felt dangerous, like standing on ice that was thinner than it looked. Otto caught his eye and smiled, sad and knowing. "Getting comfortable, boy?" he asked quietly. Klaus didn't answer. He couldn't. Because yes, he was, and that terrified him more than any torture could have. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early October. Klaus was eating breakfast when the camp clerk called his name across the mess hall. Red Cross envelope, forwarded through channels so complex that Klaus couldn't track them all. His hands shook as he opened it. The words were in his aunt's handwriting, not his mother's. That told him everything before he read a single sentence. Soviet advance, village destroyed. His mother and two sisters, Greta 16 and little Hannah only 11, missing, presumed dead. The house gone. Everything gone. His aunt had survived only because she'd been visiting cousins 2 villages over. She was sorry. So sorry. She hoped he was safe, wherever the Americans had taken him. Klaus read it 3 times. The words didn't change. He folded the letter carefully, placed it in his pocket, and walked out of the mess hall. He didn't remember the walk back to the barracks. didn't remember lying down on his bunk. The world had contracted to a single point of white-hot pain in his chest. Otto found him there an hour later, curled on his side, staring at nothing. Klaus, the older man's voice was gentle. What happened? Klaus couldn't speak. He handed over the letter. Otto read it in silence, then sat heavily on the lower bunk. "Ach, boy," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." "They told us the Soviets were animals," Klaus said finally, his voice hollow. "They told us the Americans were monsters. They told us we were protecting our families." He laughed, a broken sound. "My mother is dead because we lost. But maybe she would be dead anyway because we tried to win. What was it all for, Otto? What did any of it mean?" Otto had no answer. There was no answer. Klaus stopped going to work detail. He refused breakfast, refused dinner. When they came to collect him, he turned his face to the wall and recited slogans he no longer believed. Propaganda about final victory and German superiority and the righteousness of their cause. His words tasted like ash, but they were all he had left. Every belief system he'd built his life on had crumbled. The slogans were rubble, but at least rubble was something to hold on to. They moved him to an isolation room. Not punishment exactly, just separation. Sergeant Kowalski brought his meals 3 times a day, setting the tray down without comment. Klaus didn't touch the food, didn't acknowledge the guard's presence. On the 3rd day, Kowalski sat down on the floor outside the cell. "You gonna talk?" the sergeant asked. Klaus said nothing. "Didn't think so," Kowalski said. He leaned his head back against the wall. "My brother wanted to be a teacher. History. He used to write me letters about all the things he was going to teach his students someday. How people make the same mistakes over and over, and maybe if we understood history better, we'd stop being so damn stupid." He was quiet for a moment. "Last letter I got from him, he said he was scared. Said he didn't want to die before he got to do something that mattered." Klaus's throat tightened. "He died on a beach in France," Kowalski continued. "Shot by someone who probably had a mother too. Someone who probably didn't want to be there any more than Tommy did." He stood up slowly. "I spent 2 months wanting to kill every German I saw. Wanted to make you all pay for taking my little brother away from me." He picked up the untouched breakfast tray. "Then I spent a month watching you work in that field, watching Otto talk about his girls, watching you all try to figure out how the world got flipped upside down." He looked at Klaus through the bars. "War doesn't choose who deserves to grieve, kid. We all just lose." He left. Klaus stared at the place where he'd been standing. Outside, the camp operated with its usual efficiency, but tension crept through like smoke under a door. Word had spread about fraternization. Guards and prisoners smoking together, sharing songs, acting like war didn't matter. Command sent a memo. Major Hartley called Sergeant Kowalski to his office and reminded him, voice flat with regulation, that these men were enemy combatants, not friends. The Geneva Convention required fair treatment, not friendship. There was a difference. Remember it. Meanwhile, in town, whispers about Maggie Schreiber grew louder. Someone spray-painted traitor across her barn in dripping red letters. She scrubbed it off and said nothing. Her tyres were slashed, all 4, a calculated cruelty that cost more than malice. She patched them and bought used replacements with money she didn't have. Then the brick came through her kitchen window with a note wrapped around it. "Feeding the enemy while our boys die." She swept up the glass with shaking hands and nailed boards over the window. She didn't report it. Who would she report it to? The sheriff whose nephew had died at Anzio. The deputy whose son was fighting in the Philippines. That Sunday, she didn't request prisoner labour for the coming week. Ben delivered the news to Otto and the others without explanation. They nodded, understanding without being told. The world was reasserting itself. The brief moment of shared humanity was closing. Otto visited Klaus in isolation against regulations. The old soldier spoke through the bars about Maggie's barn, about the increasing restrictions, about how the guards had stopped offering cigarettes. "It's all falling apart," Otto said quietly. "Everything we built these past weeks. Fear's winning again." Klaus turned to face the wall. "Let it fall apart. Let it all burn. What did any of it matter when his mother was dead, and his sisters were gone, and the world was nothing but lies built on graves?" On the 5th day, Ben Kowalski brought lunch and didn't leave. He sat on the floor outside the cell and unwrapped his own sandwich, eating slowly. Klaus ignored him, but the sergeant's presence was solid, unavoidable. "My brother was 21, Ben said finally. Wanted to be a teacher. History." He took another bite, chewed thoughtfully. "Smart kid, always reading. Used to drive me crazy with facts about Roman emperors and Napoleon and all that." He paused. "He wrote me that he was scared, week before the invasion. Said he didn't want to die before he'd done something that mattered." Klaus's chest tightened, but he didn't move. "I got the telegram in July," Ben continued. "They sent his things 3 weeks later. Letters he'd written but never mailed. A book about teaching methods. A photograph of our mother." His voice stayed level, empty of emotion. "I wanted to hate someone for it. Needed to. So I hated every German I saw. Easy math, right? You killed him, so I hate you." Klaus heard the sergeant shift position. "Then I watched you work in that field for 3 weeks. Watched Otto talk about his daughters, Anna and Sophie, right? Watched you all trying to figure out how the world turned upside down." Ben was quiet for a moment. "My mother taught school too. 1st grade. She loved those kids like they were her own." Klaus rolled over slowly. Through the bars he could see Ben sitting with his back against the wall, sandwich forgotten in his hands. "War doesn't choose who deserves to grieve," Ben said, meeting Klaus's eyes. "We all just lose. That's the only fair thing about it." They sat in silence. Not absolution, not forgiveness. Just 2 men who understood that grief was grief, regardless of which uniform you wore. The next morning, Ben made a decision that could cost him his rank. He pulled Klaus from isolation, filled out the paperwork to return him to work detail, and accepted full responsibility for the decision when Major Hartley questioned it. "The kid needs to work," Ben said flatly. "Sitting in that cell, he's just dying slower. That help anybody." Hartley studied him for a long moment, then signed the authorization. "This is on you, Sergeant." "Yes, sir." Klaus returned to the barracks that night to find Otto waiting with a chess set someone had carved from scrap wood. They played in silence, neither good at the game, both grateful for something to do with their hands. "You don't get to quit," Otto said quietly, moving a pawn. "None of us do. That's what living means now. We just keep going." Meanwhile, something shifted in town. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson stood in her kitchen staring at the casserole she'd made for the church social, thinking about Maggie Schreiber eating alone in that house with boards over her window. She thought about her own son, Robert, fighting somewhere in the Pacific, and about how she'd want someone to show his mother kindness if their positions were reversed. She wrapped the casserole in a towel and drove to Maggie's farm before she could talk herself out of it. Maggie answered the door with suspicion etched in every line of her face. Eleanor held out the dish. "I'm sorry about Heinrich," she said simply, "and I'm sorry about my silence." Maggie's hands shook as she took the casserole. "Why now?" "Because I've been a coward," Eleanor said, "and because this town is eating itself alive with fear, and I'm tired of it." She met Maggie's eyes. "Your husband died wearing American green. That should have been enough. It should have always been enough." She left before Maggie could respond, but as she drove away, she saw Maggie standing in the doorway holding that casserole like it was something precious. The next Sunday, 2 more neighbours appeared at Maggie's door, then 3 more the following week. Not everyone, not even most, but enough to matter. Work detail resumed at Maggie's farm in late October. The harvest season was nearly finished, but there was winter preparation, turning soil, repairing fences, clearing ditches. Ben led the same crew back, Klaus and Otto and 4 others. Maggie met them at the gate. She looked older, worn down by weeks of isolation, but her spine was straight. "Welcome back," she said in German, and there was weight in those simple words. They worked through the morning in careful silence, finding their rhythm again. At lunch, Maggie brought out sandwiches as before, distributed equally, but this time she also brought something else. A cake, chocolate, real sugar. Klaus could see the ration stamps it must have cost. "My husband would have wanted this," Maggie said, cutting careful slices. Heinrich believed that people are just people, that the uniform doesn't change what's underneath. She handed the first piece to Klaus. He was right. Klaus took the plate with trembling hands. The cake was rich, sweet, perfect. It tasted like his mother's baking, like every birthday and Christmas morning he'd ever known. Tears came before he could stop them, running down his face while he chewed. Otto spoke what they were all thinking. "We never had a chance. Not because your soldiers were better, because you never stopped seeing us as human, even when we forgot how." They ate in silence, guards and prisoners and one widow who'd lost everything but refused to lose herself. The cake disappeared, shared equally, and for a moment the war felt very far away. Klaus looked around at the faces gathered there under the Texas sky. Ben with his Purple Heart and his dead brother's photograph, Otto with his daughter's names like prayers on his lips, Maggie with her boarded window and her husband's memory. All of them broken in different ways by the same machine. All of them choosing, in this small moment, to be human anyway. The work continued into November as winter approached, each day a small act of defiance against the hatred that wanted to consume them all. Klaus wrote more letters, knowing most would never arrive, writing them anyway because the act of reaching out mattered more than the certainty of connection. He learned more English, stumbling through conversations with guards who corrected his grammar with surprising patience. He saved his camp scrip and bought small things at the canteen, marveling each time at the abundance, the casual waste of a nation that had never known true scarcity. Sometimes at night he would lie in his bunk and think about the propaganda films he'd watched back home, the ones that showed America as a decadent wasteland populated by mongrels and degenerates too weak to fight. He thought about the promises the top man had made, the one they weren't supposed to name anymore, promises of inevitable victory and racial superiority. All of it had been smoke. Worse than smoke, because smoke at least rose from something real, some actual fire. The promises had been built on nothing but air and hate and the desperate need to believe that their suffering had meaning. Otto became something like a father to him during those months, filling a void Klaus hadn't realized was there. The older man had a way of sitting with silence, of not demanding conversation when there was nothing useful to say. They played chess most evenings, and Otto taught Klaus the little tricks he'd learned over years of playing in various barracks and trenches. "Your problem is you think too much about what you want to do," Otto would say. "Think about what I want to do. That's how you win at chess. That's how you survive most things." Ben Kowalski remained a complicated figure, respected but distant, a man who'd clearly decided that doing his job well was the only way to honour his brother's memory. He never spoke about Tommy again after that conversation outside Klaus's cell, but sometimes Klaus would catch him staring off into the distance with an expression that suggested he was having a conversation with someone who wasn't there. The other guards took their cues from Ben, maintaining professional distance but without cruelty. They were just men doing a job, most of them counting the days until they could go home to wives and children and lives that didn't involve watching the enemy eat breakfast. The camp settled into its winter routine. Work details became less frequent as the farming season ended. Instead, prisoners were assigned to maintenance crews, repairing barracks, clearing drainage ditches, chopping wood for the stoves that would heat them through the cold months. Klaus learned carpentry from a prisoner who'd been a furniture maker in Hamburg. He learned basic plumbing from another who'd worked in his father's shop in Munich. Skills he'd never imagined needing, practical knowledge that felt more valuable than anything he'd learned in the Wehrmacht. December brought the first real cold snap, a thin crust of ice on the water troughs in the morning that shattered under their fingers. It brought something else too. News filtering in from Europe of the big man's last desperate gamble in the Ardennes, a final push that everyone knew was doomed before it started. The prisoners listened to these reports with a strange mixture of emotions: pride in their countrymen's fighting spirit, shame at the futility of it all, relief that they were here, safe, well-fed, far from the frozen hell of Belgium in winter. Christmas came quietly. The camp chaplain, a soft-spoken man from Iowa, organized a service that prisoners could attend if they wished. Klaus went, more out of curiosity than faith, and found himself in a room with 40 other Germans singing Silent Night in their native language, while American guards stood respectfully at the back. The chaplain spoke about hope and redemption and the possibility of peace, his words translated by someone who stumbled over theological terms but captured the spirit. Afterward, there was cocoa, real chocolate mixed with hot milk and sugar, a luxury that made Klaus think of his sisters and wonder if they'd suffered before the end, or if it had come quick and clean. Maggie invited the work detail for a Christmas meal, a gesture that required special permission from Major Hartley and caused considerable debate among the camp command. Ben vouched for her and for them, and the permission came through. On Christmas Eve, 6 prisoners and 2 guards sat around Maggie's kitchen table eating roasted chicken and potatoes and green beans put up from the summer harvest. Maggie said grace in English, then in German, thanking God for the food and for the unlikely company and for the possibility that maybe, someday, this madness would end. They ate without talking much, the meal itself serving as communication. Klaus helped with the dishes afterward, standing at Maggie's sink and washing plates while she dried, and she told him about Heinrich, how they'd met at a church social in San Antonio, how he'd courted her in terrible German he'd learned from a book, how he'd proposed on a bridge over the river with fireflies rising around them, how he'd enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, even though he was 38 and could have claimed exemption. He believed in this country, Maggie said, her hands moving steadily with the dish towel. He believed it was worth protecting, and he believed the best way to honour his parents' homeland was to fight against what it had become. Klaus didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and kept washing dishes. Sometimes silence was the only honest response. On the truck ride back to camp, Klaus sat watching the Texas night roll past, stars brilliant in the cold air, and thought about belief. What it meant to believe in something enough to die for it. Whether dying for a belief made it true or just made you dead. He was still thinking about it when they rolled through the camp gates and he climbed down from the truck, his breath misting in the December air. The year turned. 1945 arrived with no fanfare. Just another day of routine and work and waiting. News from Europe grew increasingly grim for Germany. Cities falling, lines collapsing, the Red Army grinding westward like an inexorable machine, American bombers turning what was left into rubble. Klaus listened to these reports and felt nothing, a numbness that Otto assured him was normal. "You can only grieve so much before you run out," the older man said. "Eventually you just go empty. That's not wrong. That's just surviving." January brought word that the big man himself had retreated to his bunker in Berlin, that the dream of a 1,000-year Reich was dying in its 12th year, choking on its own poison. The prisoners received this news in various ways. Some wept, some celebrated quietly. Most just absorbed it and went back to whatever they'd been doing. Klaus felt a strange sense of relief. An ending was coming. Maybe not a good ending, nothing about this could be good, but an ending nonetheless. And after an ending came the terrifying question of what came next. In February, Maggie's farm began preparing for spring planting. The work detail resumed in earnest, and Klaus found comfort in the physical labour, the simple clarity of soil and seeds and water. He learned the Texas growing season, so different from what he'd known in Germany. He learned which crops thrived in the heat and which needed shade. He learned how to read the sky for rain and how to tell good soil from bad just by how it felt in his hand. Practical knowledge. Skills he could use to build something if he ever got the chance. Ben Kowalski received orders in March. Transfer to a training command stateside, a desk job that would keep him away from combat for the duration. He told the work detail over lunch one day, his voice carefully neutral, and Klaus saw the conflict in his eyes. Relief at being done with this, guilt at feeling relieved, a sense that he was abandoning something unfinished. Before he left, he pulled Klaus aside. "You're going to be all right," he said. "I don't know what all right looks like for you after this, but you'll find it." Klaus wanted to ask how Ben could possibly know that, but instead he just nodded and shook the sergeant's hand. Some questions didn't have answers. You just had to trust that asking them mattered. April brought news of the big man's death, suicide in his bunker while Berlin burned around him. The camp received the information via official channels and passed it to the prisoners without commentary. Klaus sat in the barracks and tried to feel something about it. The man who'd promised them greatness and delivered only ash. The man whose words had sent millions to die for lies. But all Klaus felt was tired. Justice or revenge or satisfaction, none of it would bring his mother back. None of it would undo the years of propaganda that had twisted their understanding of the world. The man was dead. The dream was dead. All that remained was figuring out how to live in the wreckage. May brought surrender. Unconditional. Total. The war in Europe was over. The camp held formations to deliver the news, and the prisoners stood in neat rows listening to their defeat made official. Some men collapsed. Some stood rigid. Klaus just breathed, in and out, and thought about how strange it was to still be alive. By every reasonable calculation, he should have died in Normandy or the retreat after. Should have died in a dozen different ways. But he hadn't. He was here, in Texas, under a huge sky, and now there was no war to go back to, just the question of what came after. The weeks following surrender were strange. The prisoners were still prisoners, but the nature of their captivity changed. They were no longer enemy combatants. They were defeated soldiers awaiting repatriation to a country that no longer existed in the form they'd left it. News filtered in about Germany's partition, about occupation zones, about starvation and destroyed cities and millions displaced. Klaus read letters from his aunt describing conditions that made wartime seem mild by comparison. No food, no fuel, no shelter for countless refugees. The victors were sharing Germany like a pie, and the people who lived there were ingredients to be distributed as needed. Maggie's farm became Klaus's anchor through those uncertain months. The work continued because crops didn't care about politics or surrender or occupation zones. Seeds still needed planting, weeds still needed pulling. The basic mechanics of feeding people remained constant regardless of who'd won what war. Klaus found profound comfort in that constancy. Here was something real, something that produced actual results. You put a seed in the ground, you watered it, you waited. Life followed simple rules. By summer, the camp population was dropping as prisoners were processed for return. Otto left in July, bound for the British zone where his daughters waited if they'd survived. The old soldier hugged Klaus hard and made him promise to write, to find him somehow when Klaus eventually went back. "They'll need carpenters in the new Germany," Otto said. "They'll need builders. You remember that. You know how to build now." Klaus watched the truck carry Otto away and felt the loss like a physical thing, one more person gone from his shrinking world. More prisoners left through the fall. The camp grew emptier, quieter. Klaus remained, partly due to bureaucratic delays, partly due to his own half-formed requests to stay longer. The authorities were in no hurry to send Germans back to a Germany that could barely feed its own people. Winter came again. Klaus worked on Maggie's farm when weather permitted and took classes the camp offered in the off hours. English literature, American history, basic bookkeeping. He absorbed it all with the hunger of someone trying to understand the place that had shown him unexpected mercy. In December of 45, more than a year after he'd arrived, Klaus received his repatriation orders. He had 2 weeks. The news should have brought relief or joy or something positive. Instead, he felt panic. Germany was rubble and occupation and starvation. Texas was Maggie's farm and regular meals and the possibility of building something. He didn't want to leave. Maggie offered him a solution that should have been impossible. "I've filed paperwork," she said one afternoon in her kitchen. "Sponsorship for agricultural workers, the new immigration laws, they're allowing some exceptions." She looked at him steadily. "Heinrich would have wanted me to help someone. You work hard, you're honest, and this farm needs someone who knows what they're doing. I'm getting too old to do it alone." Klaus stared at her, unable to process what she was suggesting. "You want me to stay, here, work for you?" She smiled, sad and knowing. "I want to offer you a choice. Go back to Germany if that's where you need to be, or stay here and help me build something. Either way, you've got worth, Klaus. Don't forget that." The paperwork took months to process, months of uncertainty and waiting and bureaucratic tangles that threatened to collapse the whole fragile possibility. But in March of 1946, 16 months after he'd arrived in that cattle car expecting torture, Klaus Zimmermann walked out of the POW camp as a free man with legal authorization to remain in the United States as a sponsored agricultural worker. He carried everything he owned in a single duffel bag, walked to Maggie's farm, and got back to work. Years later, he would think about that journey often. The cattle car that had brought him here, the bread smell that had shattered every expectation, the water offered by a tired nurse, the stew with actual meat, all the small mercies that had slowly rebuilt his understanding of humanity. He would think about Otto and Ben and Maggie, about how they'd all been broken by the same machine and had chosen, in their different ways, to refuse to let it break them completely. He would think about the magazine showing American factories, about the realization that they'd never had a chance, and about what it meant to surrender not just the war, but the entire world view that had demanded the war in the first place. He married an American girl in 1948, a teacher from Dallas who didn't care where he'd come from, only where he was going. They bought Maggie's farm when she retired in 52 and ran it together for 40 years. He became a citizen in 55, swearing an oath to a country that had fed him when it could have starved him, that had treated him with dignity when it would have been easier to show contempt. He never forgot what that meant, never took it for granted. Sometimes new immigrants would come through town, refugees from whatever new crisis had erupted somewhere in the world, and Klaus would go out of his way to help them, to offer work, a meal, a friendly word in whatever language they spoke. Because he remembered. He remembered standing in that camp yard in 1944, terrified and prepared for the worst, and receiving instead the radical gift of basic human decency. He remembered learning that the enemy had been right all along, but not in the way the propaganda had taught. They'd been right to believe in something better, right to fight for a world where mercy wasn't weakness and compassion wasn't foolishness. Right to see past uniforms and borders and propaganda to the simple truth that people were just people and that mattered more than any ideology. He told his children and grandchildren this story, told it plainly without embellishment, because he wanted them to understand, wanted them to know that the worst moments in history came when people forgot to see each other as human, when they let fear and hate and propaganda turn neighbours into enemies, when they chose the easy comfort of believing lies rather than facing difficult truths. He told them about the bread smell, about the cold water, about the cake Maggie had shared after weeks of isolation, about all the small acts of resistance against a machine that wanted to turn everyone into either victims or monsters. The story always ended the same way, with Klaus standing in Maggie's field in early spring, planting seeds in good Texas soil, feeling the sun on his back and knowing with absolute certainty that he'd been given a gift beyond measure. Not just survival, though that would have been enough, but the chance to rebuild, to become something better than what the war had tried to make him, to prove that people could choose kindness even when the world had given them every excuse for cruelty. That was the real victory, he would say, not beating the enemy, but refusing to become them.